You've said something you immediately regretted. Not a small thing. Something that damaged a relationship, cost you an opportunity, or revealed a side of yourself you didn't recognize. And in the aftermath, lying awake at 2 in the morning, you thought, that wasn't me. Something came over me. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It was you. There is a version of you operating beneath your conscious awareness right now, shaping your decisions, distorting your perception, pulling you toward patterns you can't see and can't stop. It has a name. It's called human nature. And most people will go their entire lives without ever understanding how it works. What if you didn't have to be one of them? During this video, I'll walk you through 6 laws that govern how people think, feel, and act, often without knowing it. These aren't abstract theories. They're patterns you can observe in the people around you tomorrow morning, in your boss, in your partner, in your closest friend, and most importantly, in yourself. These laws explain why intelligent people make terrible decisions under pressure, why charming people turn out to be the most dangerous, why you keep falling into the same traps in your relationships, your career, and your own mind, even when you swore you'd learned your lesson. Each law is built around a simple idea that beneath the surface of everyday behavior, there are forces most people never examine, forces rooted in how we evolved, how we were raised, and how our brains are wired. These forces don't announce themselves. They don't ask permission. They just act. And the people who understand them, the rare few throughout history who've actually done the work of looking beneath the surface, they don't just avoid mistakes. They see what others miss. They read people with uncanny precision. They make decisions that hold up years later, while everyone else is scrambling to undo the damage of last week. This is not about becoming cold or manipulative. It's about waking up. It's about seeing reality clearly enough to stop being a puppet of forces you don't understand. And it starts with the most uncomfortable realization of all. Law 1. The law of irrationality. What would you say if I told you that the greatest leader of the ancient world, a man who built one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history, succeeded not because he was the boldest or the most ambitious, but because he did something almost nobody else could do? He controlled his emotions. Around 460 BC, a man named Pericles entered public life in Athens. Now, Athens at this time was a democracy, but it was a messy one. Leaders rose and fell every few years. They gave fiery speeches, stirred up crowds, and played to whatever faction would keep them in power. The landowners, the soldiers, the aristocrats. They took reckless military gambles to win personal glory. And when things went wrong, as they always did, they blamed their enemies or the gods. Pericles was different, and the Athenians found him strange because of it. He came from one of the most powerful aristocratic families in the city. He could have allied himself with the elite. Instead, he did something that stunned everyone. He aligned himself with the lower and middle classes, the farmers, the craftsmen, the sailors who powered the Athenian navy. Not a small faction he could control, but the broad majority of citizens. And slowly, through years of consistent effort, he earned their trust. But what really set Pericles apart was his style. Where other leaders gave passionate, dramatic speeches designed to whip up emotion, Pericles spoke with restraint. He built airtight arguments. He laid out his reasoning step by step, and people found themselves leaning in, not because they were dazzled, but because they were actually following the logic. It was compelling precisely because it was calm. And here's what made him truly unusual. When the assembly descended into chaos, shouting, factions screaming at each other, tempers boiling over, Pericles would sometimes physically remove himself. He would go home. He would sit alone for days. Not because he was weak, because he understood something the others didn't. He understood that the moment you make a decision while gripped by strong emotion, anger, fear, excitement, resentment, you are no longer thinking, you are reacting. And a reaction is not a strategy. Under his leadership, Athens entered a golden age. He didn't waste money on unnecessary wars. He consolidated the empire instead of overextending it. And with the surplus, he launched one of the most ambitious building projects in history, transforming Athens into the most beautiful city in the ancient world. Temples, theaters, concert halls, the Parthenon itself, with its enormous statue of the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom and practical intelligence. For over 30 years, one man, through nothing more than rational, disciplined thinking, shaped an entire civilization. So what happened when he was gone? In 432 BC, Sparta delivered an ultimatum to Athens: accept our terms or face war. The assembly erupted. Hawks wanted to attack immediately. Doves wanted to surrender. Emotions were running high, and no one could agree on anything. Then Pericles stood up, and the room went quiet. His proposal was unlike anything they'd heard before. Don't attack, don't surrender. Bring everyone inside the city walls. Let the Spartans march through our farmlands and destroy our crops. Don't take the bait. Use the navy to raid their coastline. Be patient. Their army is expensive to maintain. Their allies will start bickering. Eventually they'll come to us for peace, and we'll have won without a single pitched battle. It was brilliant. It was counterintuitive, and it required the one thing the Athenians were worst at: patience. They approved the plan, and for a while it worked. The Spartans came. They burned fields and orchards. The Athenians watched from behind their walls and held firm. But then, in the second year of the war, disaster struck. A plague swept through the city. With so many people packed inside the walls, it spread like wildfire. A third of the population died, including Pericles. And this is where the story turns from inspiring to terrifying. Because the moment Pericles was gone, the Athenians didn't just lose a leader. They lost the one person who had been holding their emotions in check. The factions came roaring back. The war party seized control. Patience was abandoned. Restraint was mocked as weakness. The Athenians grew bitter, aggressive, and hungry for revenge. At one point, they attacked the island of Melos, a Spartan ally, and when the people surrendered, the Athenians voted to execute every man and sell the women and children into slavery. Nothing like this had ever happened under Pericles. Then came the final act. In 415 BC, Athenian leaders hatched a plan to launch a massive naval expedition against Syracuse, a powerful city on the island of Sicily, and a key Spartan ally. One commander, Nicias, warned them it was too risky. The forces of Syracuse were being underestimated. His argument backfired. Instead of canceling the expedition, the assembly doubled its size. If a bigger force was needed, fine, send everything. On the day the fleet launched, it was the most spectacular thing Athens had ever seen. Hundreds of ships filled the harbor. Soldiers in gleaming armor crowded the decks. Citizens lined the shore, drawing maps of Sicily in the dirt, dreaming of the riches that would pour in. Every single one of those ships was destroyed. Almost every soldier was killed. The greatest military disaster in Athenian history. Within a few years, Athens surrendered to Sparta. The democracy collapsed. The golden age was over, and the man who had held it all together through nothing more than disciplined, rational thinking had been dead for over 2 decades. Think about it. The same city, the same people, the same resources and intelligence. The only thing that changed was the removal of one rational mind, and an entire civilization tore itself apart. So what does this have to do with you? More than you'd like to admit. Because the forces that destroyed Athens are operating inside your mind right now, and unless you understand them, they will shape your life in ways you cannot see. Here's the core of this law. We all believe we are rational. We think we weigh evidence, consider options, and arrive at decisions through logic. But the truth is that our emotions are constantly influencing our thinking. Not occasionally, not in extreme moments, but always. Every thought you have is colored by whatever you're feeling beneath the surface. And most of the time, you have no idea this is happening. This isn't a character flaw, it's biology. Our brains evolved in layers. The oldest part handles instinct. Above that sits the limbic system, which processes emotion. And on top of that, the most recent addition is the neocortex, which handles rational thought and language. These systems are not seamlessly connected. Emotions are processed faster and deeper than conscious thought. By the time you become aware of what you're feeling, that feeling has already begun to shape what you think. Here's a scenario you've probably lived through. You're angry at someone, a colleague, a friend, your partner. You're convinced you know exactly why. They did something thoughtless or disrespectful, and your anger is completely justified. But if you sat with that anger for a day or two, if you really dug into it, you might discover that the true source has nothing to do with this person. Maybe it's an old wound from childhood, a sensitivity that gets triggered by a certain tone of voice. Maybe it's envy you don't want to admit. They have something you want, and rather than face that uncomfortable truth, your mind converts it into righteous anger. Maybe you were already frustrated about something else entirely, and this person simply walked into the crossfire. We do this constantly. We feel an emotion, and then we construct a story to explain it. A story that flatters us, that protects our ego, that points the finger outward, and we believe that story completely. That's what makes irrationality so dangerous. It doesn't feel irrational. It feels like the truth. There are specific biases that flow from this, patterns of distorted thinking so deeply embedded in us that you can find them in every culture and every period of history. There's confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out evidence that supports what you already believe and ignore everything that contradicts it. You see this everywhere. A person who is excited about a new business plan will find experts and data to justify it. They won't look for the data that says it's a terrible idea. Someone asked for advice will nod along, but only hear the parts that confirm what they already wanted to do. There's the conviction bias, the assumption that if someone expresses an idea with great passion and certainty, it must be true. We're wired to be impressed by intensity. A leader who pounds the table and speaks with absolute confidence seems more trustworthy than one who acknowledges nuance and uncertainty, even though the second person is almost always closer to reality. Demagogues and salesmen have exploited this for centuries. And have you ever noticed how easily you believe that you're more rational, more fair-minded, and more ethical than the people around you? That's the superiority bias. In study after study, when people are asked to rate themselves compared to the average person, the vast majority put themselves above the midpoint. We are all, apparently, above average, which is of course impossible. The very belief that you are immune to irrationality is itself a form of irrationality, and it is perhaps the most dangerous one of all, because it prevents you from looking inward. There's also the blame bias, the deeply human tendency to attribute our failures to external forces while taking personal credit for our successes. When a project falls apart, it was the team, the timing, the economy, bad luck. When a project succeeds, it was our vision and hard work. This pattern keeps us from ever truly learning from what went wrong, which guarantees we'll repeat the same mistakes until the pattern itself becomes our fate. And then there are trigger points. Moments when something in the present hits an old wound, usually from childhood, and the emotional response that follows is wildly out of proportion to what actually happened. A partner makes a mildly critical comment, and suddenly you feel a surge of rage or abandonment that makes no sense in context. That's not the present speaking, that's the past hijacking the present, and it will keep happening until you learn to recognize the trigger for what it is. So what's the antidote? It's not about eliminating emotion. Pericles himself valued bold action, inspiration, and love for his city. Emotions give us energy. They fuel creativity and ambition. The goal isn't to become a machine. The goal is balance, understanding why you feel what you feel so that your emotions serve your thinking instead of hijacking it. Train yourself to never make an important decision in the grip of a strong emotion. Step back, sleep on it. Write the angry email, but don't send it. Give yourself time, because time is the enemy of irrationality. The longer you wait, the more space your rational mind has to reassert itself. Question yourself relentlessly. When you feel certain about something, ask why. When you're angry, dig beneath the surface. When a plan excites you, look for the evidence that says it won't work, not the evidence that says it will. That discipline, practiced daily, is what separates rational people from everyone else. Pericles worshipped the goddess Athena, not as a supernatural being, but as a symbol of the highest power a human can develop. Practical wisdom, clear thinking in the midst of chaos, the ability to see reality as it actually is, not as your emotions want it to be. That power exists inside you right now. It's not something you're born with, it's something you build. And the first step is accepting that you are not nearly as rational as you think you are. But even if you master your own emotions, even if you become the most rational person in the room, there's another force that can undo everything. A force that makes people charming on the surface and hollow underneath. A force that lives, to some degree, inside every one of us. Law 2. The law of narcissism. Have you ever met someone so charming, so magnetic, so intensely interested in you, that you felt a kind of bond forming almost instantly? They listened like no one else. They remembered small details. They made you feel seen. And then, weeks or months later, something shifted. The warmth disappeared. The charm turned cold. And you realized that the entire time, the connection you thought you had was flowing in only one direction. If that sounds familiar, you've probably encountered what we might call a deep narcissist. And understanding how they operate and how narcissism operates inside all of us is one of the most important things you can learn about human nature. Let's start with one of the most extreme examples in history. In the early years of the Soviet Union, people who met Joseph Stalin for the first time were almost universally surprised. They expected a cold dictator. What they got was warmth. He insisted everyone address him informally. He was accessible even to junior officials. When he listened, his eyes locked onto yours with such intensity that you felt like the only person in the room. He would put his arm around you as he walked you out of his office, always ending the meeting on an intimate note. People left those meetings wanting to see him again. One young official later wrote that Stalin created the feeling that there was now a bond linking them forever. He had this gift, making you feel like you were inside the inner circle, like you mattered, and for years it worked. Through this charm, Stalin slowly accumulated power until he controlled every lever of the Soviet state. But as his grip tightened, another side of his character began to leak through. The first real sign came through his closest friend, a man named Sergei Kirov. Kirov was a loyal member of Stalin's inner circle. Simple, enthusiastic, easy to like. In 1934, several regional leaders approached Kirov with a proposal. They were tired of Stalin's brutality toward the peasants. They wanted to overthrow him and make Kirov the new leader. Kirov refused. He went straight to Stalin and revealed the entire plot. You would think Stalin would be grateful, and on the surface he was. He thanked Kirov profusely, but something changed in his manner from that moment on. A coldness that had never been there before. Think about what Kirov had actually done. He'd revealed, without meaning to, that he was more popular than Stalin, that other people preferred him. For a man whose entire psychology was built around controlling how others perceived him, this was not a gift, it was a threat. Kirov could feel the danger. He tried everything, praising Stalin more publicly, mentioning his name in every speech, being more deferential than ever. But this only made things worse. It looked like he was trying too hard to cover something up. And then Kirov remembered all the jokes he'd made at Stalin's expense over the years, jokes that had once been a sign of closeness. Now they would be read as insults. In December of that year, A lone gunman assassinated Kirillov outside his office. No one could directly prove Stalin's involvement, but almost no one doubted it, and what followed was the Great Purge. Hundreds of thousands arrested. Almost every one of Stalin's top lieutenants was tortured into confessing to imaginary crimes. Stalin would listen eagerly as the interrogators described how his once brave friends had wept and begged on their knees for forgiveness. He laughed at their humiliation. The charming man who put his arm around you was the same man who sent you to die. And this is the part that most people find hardest to understand. How can someone who seems so warm, so attuned to others, be so completely hollow underneath? The answer lies in understanding what narcissism actually is. And it's not what most people think. We all need attention. That's not narcissism. That's being human. We're social animals. Without recognition from others, we start to feel invisible. But most of us, at some point in early childhood, develop an internal mechanism to handle this. We build a self, a sense of who we are, what we value, what makes us worthy. This self acts like a thermostat. When we feel ignored or criticized, we can retreat to this inner self and stabilize. We don't need constant external validation to feel okay. Deep narcissists never built that thermostat. Something went wrong in their earliest years. A parent who was absent or smothering, an environment that gave them no room to develop a stable sense of self. Without that inner foundation, they are completely dependent on the attention of others to feel alive. Every interaction becomes a transaction, not about connection, but about extraction. They need your admiration, your sympathy, your focus, and they have developed extraordinary skills to get it. You can recognize them by certain patterns. If they are insulted or challenged, even mildly, they react with disproportionate rage because there is nothing inside to absorb the blow. They position themselves as victims. They are prickly and oversensitive. Almost everything is taken personally. You will notice an impatient or distant look on their face whenever the conversation turns to something that doesn't involve them. They display extreme confidence, which neatly covers the emptiness behind it. But put that confidence to a real test, and it collapses. So how does someone like Stalin, who clearly cannot genuinely connect with anyone, manage to be so magnetic? Because deep narcissists are hypersensitive. They've spent their whole lives scanning other people for signs of approval or rejection. And at some point, the ambitious ones discover they can turn that sensitivity outward, not to empathize, but to manipulate. They learn to read your insecurities, your desires, your weak spots. They mirror warmth because they've studied warmth. They simulate interest because they've learned exactly what interest looks like. The difference between genuine empathy and narcissistic charm is what happens after the performance. A person with real empathy stays connected. A narcissist pulls back the moment they've gotten what they need. You feel the warmth, and then it vanishes. And that alternation, closeness followed by coldness, is actually part of the strategy, even if it's unconscious. It keeps you off balance. It makes you chase the warmth. This played out in the most chilling way in Stalin's final years. By then, his lieutenants lived in constant terror. The worst fate was to be invited to dinner at his house. Nobody could refuse. He forced everyone to drink heavily, while his own drinks were diluted, watching to see if anyone would say something incriminating as they lost control. And then, at the end of the night, he would pull out a gramophone, put on some music, and order the men to dance. He made Nikita Khrushchev, the future leader of the Soviet Union, do a traditional folk dance that involved squatting and kicking until Khrushchev was physically ill. The others he paired together and forced to slow dance while he sat watching, laughing at the sight of grown men shuffling across the floor in each other's arms. This was the ultimate expression of control, the puppet master choreographing every move. And in the end, when Stalin suffered a stroke, none of his lieutenants dared call a doctor or help him. He died from their neglect. The man who controlled everything had lost control of the one thing that mattered. Now, here's where this law gets personal. We are all on the narcissism spectrum, every one of us. You feel a pull when someone flatters you. You bristle when someone criticizes you. In conversation, part of your mind is always waiting for your turn to talk, to share your story, to redirect attention back to yourself. That's not evil, it's human wiring. The question isn't whether you're narcissistic. The question is where you fall on the spectrum and which direction you're heading. People who develop what we can call healthy narcissism have a strong enough sense of self that they can afford to direct their attention outward. They're genuinely curious about other people. They can absorb criticism without crumbling. They can laugh at their own flaws. And because they're not constantly scanning for threats to their ego, they have mental space to actually connect with others and focus on their work. And here's the part that changes everything. The tool that separates healthy narcissists from everyone else, the tool that was completely absent in someone like Stalin, is empathy. Consider a man named Ernest Shackleton. In 1915, Shackleton's ship became trapped in Antarctic ice, stranding 27 men in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. No radio, no rescue coming, dwindling food, months of total darkness ahead. Shackleton understood immediately that the greatest danger was not the cold or the ice. It was morale. If even a few men became resentful or hopeless, the negativity would spread, decisions would suffer, cooperation would collapse. And in this environment, that meant death. So every morning he woke before anyone else and prepared hot tea. He served it personally to each man. As he did, he read their faces, their posture, their energy. He wasn't just being polite, he was diagnosing. He could sense when someone's spirit was dropping before the person even realized it themselves. Around the campfire each evening, he moved from man to man, adjusting his conversation to match each personality. With the scientists, he talked science. With the more reflective types, he discussed poetry. He picked up on the photographer's need to feel important and started consulting him on key decisions. He noticed the navigator was self-centered and needed extra attention, so he talked to him more than anyone else. He organized sporting events on the ice during the sunless days and entertainments at night, music, practical jokes, storytelling. Every holiday was celebrated with a feast. The endless days of drifting on a frozen ocean were somehow filled with moments that kept men's spirits from cracking. He identified the potential troublemakers early and placed them in his own tent, not as punishment, but so he could keep them close and give them the attention they needed before resentment had a chance to grow. He spread the remaining malcontents across other tents, diluting their influence. Everything was deliberate. Everything was about reading the emotional temperature of the group and adjusting before it dropped to a dangerous level. When the ice floe became too dangerous and they had to take to the lifeboats, Shackleton chose his crew for the most perilous voyage, an 800-mile crossing to South Georgia Island in a tiny boat through some of the worst seas on Earth. One man he chose was Harry McNeish, the oldest and grumpiest member of the crew. A strange choice for such a brutal journey, but Shackleton put McNeish in charge of fitting out the boat. Now McNeish felt personally responsible for its survival. His mind was occupied. His sense of purpose was restored. Midway through the voyage, McNeish stopped rowing. His spirit had broken. Shackleton could feel it, but instead of yelling at him or ordering him back to work, which would have humiliated him in front of the others and made everything worse, Shackleton stopped the boat entirely. He announced that everyone was tired, including himself. He ordered hot milk for all of them. McNeish was spared the embarrassment of being singled out. He picked up his oar and didn't stop again. Every man survived, all 27, in one of the most impossible survival situations in recorded history. What Shackleton had, and what Stalin completely lacked, was the ability to turn his attention outward and genuinely enter the experience of another person, not to manipulate them, not to extract something, but to understand what they needed and provide it. That is empathy, and it is the antidote to the destructive narcissism that lives inside all of us. You build empathy the way you build any skill, through practice. Start by shutting off your internal monologue in conversation. Actually listen, not to prepare your response, but to understand. Mirror back what people say. Pay attention to tone, to body language, to the feelings beneath the words. Assume you are wrong about people more often than you are right. Approach every person as an undiscovered country, not a category, and watch for something called the attribution bias. When you make a mistake, you explain it away. Bad timing, tough circumstances, anyone would have done the same. But when someone else makes a mistake, you see it as a reflection of their character. They're careless, they're selfish, they should have known better. The fix is simple and difficult at the same time. Give other people the same benefit of the doubt you give yourself. Consider their circumstances before you judge their character. The more you practice this, the stronger the muscle becomes, and something remarkable starts to happen. People want to be around you more. Your work improves, your relationships deepen. Without trying, you start to receive the very attention and recognition that narcissists spend their whole lives chasing. The difference is that you earned it by giving first. But understanding people doesn't stop at empathy. There's an entire world of information that most people miss completely. A hidden language spoken in every conversation, in every meeting, in every glance across a room, and one man discovered it in the most unlikely way imaginable. Law 3. The law of role-playing. What if there was an entire language being spoken around you every single day, and you were missing almost all of it? One morning in August of 1919, a 17-year-old boy in rural Wisconsin woke up to find parts of his body paralyzed. Within days, the paralysis spread everywhere. He was diagnosed with polio. As he lay in bed, unable to move anything but his eyes, he overheard a conversation in the next room. Two doctors were speaking to his mother. They assumed he was asleep. One of them said, quite plainly, "The boy will be dead by morning." His mother came into the room. She was trying to hide her grief, but her face gave her away. And the boy, his name was Milton Erickson, asked her, through tremendous effort, to move the chest of drawers near his bed. She thought he was delirious, but he had a reason. There was a mirror on the chest, and he wanted it positioned just right. If he began to lose consciousness, he could focus on the sunset reflected in the mirror. The sun always came back. Maybe he would too. He fell into a coma that night, and 3 days later, against every expectation, he woke up. He'd survived, but the paralysis now covered his entire body. He couldn't move his arms, his legs, his lips. The only thing he could move were his eyes. Quarantined on the family farm, his only company was his parents, a nurse, and his 7 sisters and 1 brother. For a boy with an active mind, the boredom was excruciating. But one day, as he lay there listening to his sisters talk among themselves, something caught his attention that he had never noticed before. One sister said to another, "Yes, that's a good idea," but the way she said it, flat, monotone, with a tiny smirk flickering across her face, communicated the exact opposite. She didn't think it was a good idea at all. A yes that meant no. Erickson became fascinated. He had nothing else to do but watch and listen. Over the next day, he counted 16 different forms of the word no, each one carrying a different shade of meaning, a different emotional temperature. He noticed one sister say yes to something, while almost imperceptibly shaking her head from side to side. The mouth said one thing, the body said another. Then he caught something even more subtle. One sister offered another an apple. It seemed generous, but the tension in her face and the tightness of her arms told a completely different story. She wanted to keep it for herself. She was just being polite. The signal was right there, obvious once you looked for it. But nobody else noticed. Unable to participate in any conversation, Erickson's mind became completely absorbed in this hidden world. Hand gestures, raised eyebrows, the pitch of someone's voice shifting mid-sentence, the way his sister's neck veins would pulse when they stood over him, a sign of nervousness they had no idea they were broadcasting. He discovered that certain breathing rhythms meant boredom, and that a deliberate brushing back of hair signaled impatience, while a quicker, unconscious stroke meant the opposite, rapt attention. And he noticed something else. In conversations in the next room, where people weren't putting on a pleasant show for the sick boy, almost nobody said what they actually meant directly. Instead, they hinted. They circled around what they wanted, leaving clues in their tone of voice, hoping someone would pick up the signal and offer it to them without being asked. Sometimes the hints were taken, most of the time they were ignored entirely, and the person had to come out and state their desire plainly, trapped in a body that couldn't move. Erickson had stumbled onto what he would later call the second language, a parallel channel of communication running beneath every human interaction, a language not of words, but of faces, voices, posture, and tension, a language that reveals what people are actually thinking and feeling, often in direct contradiction to what they are saying. And here's the extraordinary part. Over the following months, something else happened. One day, sitting in a chair near a window, Erickson listened to his siblings playing outside. He wanted desperately to join them, and for a brief moment, as if his mind forgot his body was paralyzed, he felt a tiny twitch in his leg, just a muscle firing for a fraction of a second. The doctors had told his mother he would never walk again, but the doctors had been wrong before. Erickson began an experiment. He would focus his entire mind on one specific muscle in his leg. He would remember what it felt like before the paralysis. He would will it to move. His nurse would massage the area while he concentrated, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, he felt the tiniest movement return, then a little more. Through weeks and months of this process, he taught himself to stand, then to take a few steps, then to walk across a room, then to walk outside. Through nothing more than imagination, memory, and willpower, he rebuilt his body from the inside out. The mind and the body, he realized, were connected in ways no one fully understood. Erickson went on to become one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, and his approach was unlike anything in the field. While every other therapist focused on words, getting patients to talk about their childhood, their dreams, their fears, Erickson focused on the body, on presence, on what people communicated without knowing it. He placed his desk at the far end of his office, forcing every patient to walk the full length of the room toward him. In those few seconds before a single word was exchanged, he could read their level of confidence, their rigidity, their anxiety, all mapped clearly in their posture, their pace, the tension in their hands as they gripped the chair. He noticed changes in patients' walks before and after sessions. He scrutinized how people sat down, the way some would grip the armrests and others would settle in loosely. He studied walking styles everywhere he went, filling notebooks with observations. There was the emphatic stride of the persistent and resolute, the light step of the indecisive, the loping, fluid walk of the naturally lazy, the exaggerated masculine swagger that always covered up some deeper insecurity. But could he really read strangers cold? People he had never met, with no background information at all? One day, a beautiful young woman came to see him, saying she'd seen various psychiatrists, but none of them were the right fit. She chatted pleasantly, never getting into the specifics of her problem. Erickson watched her pick a piece of lint off her sleeve. Then suddenly, he told her with complete confidence that he was the right, in fact, the only psychiatrist for her. Taken aback, she asked why. He said he just needed to ask one more question. How long have you been wearing women's clothes? The patient, who was in fact a man, was stunned. Every other psychiatrist had been fooled by his extremely feminine appearance and carefully practiced voice. But Erickson had noticed the lint. When the patient picked it off, the hand moved in a straight line past the chest, no detour. Women, Erickson knew from decades of observation, instinctively make a wider arc around the breast area. It was a tiny gesture, a fraction of a second, and it told him everything. On another occasion, a woman came in saying she had a phobia of flying. Her husband was taking her abroad in September. Erickson interrupted her before she could say more. He asked her to leave the room and walk back in. She was annoyed, but she did it. He studied her walk, her posture, how she settled into the chair. Then he asked a question that had nothing to do with airplanes. "Does your husband know about your love affair?" She was astonished. He explained. Her legs were locked together with one foot tucked completely around the other ankle. In his experience, married women having affairs always locked their bodies up in the same way, and she had said the word abroad with a strange hesitation, splitting it into two syllables, abroad, as if the word itself embarrassed her. Her walk, too, had told him something. It was the walk of a woman who felt trapped in complicated relationships, a tightness in the shoulders, and a heaviness in the step that spoke of guilt carried over a long time. To patients and colleagues, it seemed like Erickson had psychic powers. He didn't. He had simply spent decades training a skill that most of us abandon in childhood. Think about it. When you were a child, you were an extraordinary observer of people. You had to be. You were small and powerless, completely dependent on adults for survival. You learned to read your parents' moods from across a room. You could tell when a smile was real and when it was forced. You sensed when someone was dangerous just from the way they moved. And then, somewhere around the age of 5 or 6, you started to lose it. You turned inward. You became more concerned with how others saw you than with what you could see in them. And by adulthood, you'd become so absorbed in your own thoughts, your own anxieties, your own plans for what to say next, that you were picking up almost none of the information streaming at you in every human interaction. Think about this. Researchers have found that more than 65% of what we communicate to each other comes through our bodies and our voices, not our words, but most people consciously register only about 5% of it. That means you are missing the vast majority of what people are telling you, their true feelings, their hidden intentions, their comfort or discomfort in your presence, because you are fixated on words, which are often the least reliable channel of all. So what should you actually look for? Start with what people try hardest to hide: dislike. When someone harbors negative feelings toward you, they almost never announce it. They smile, they say the right things, but the body leaks. Watch for the quick squint of the eyes when you say something they disagree with, the pursed lips, the torso or feet that angle away from you while the conversation continues, the arms that fold across the chest just as you're making a point. These aren't dramatic gestures. They last a fraction of a second, what psychologists call microexpressions, a momentary glare, a flash of tension in the jaw, the beginning of a frown that's suppressed before it fully forms. You won't catch them if you're staring directly at someone. You pick them up from the periphery, in quick glances, while you appear to be listening normally. Pay special attention to mixed signals. Someone congratulates you, but their smile is tight and their eyes are flat. Someone says something sarcastic and pointed, but wraps it in a jokey tone so you can't object without looking oversensitive. In both cases, give more weight to the negative cue. It is almost always closer to the truth. And on the other side, learn to recognize genuine warmth. When someone truly likes you, the muscles around their eyes relax, the forehead smooths, the lips part slightly, the pupils dilate, an automatic response in which the eyes literally let in more light. A real smile changes the entire face, pulling the cheeks upward and creating small creases at the corners of the eyes. A fake smile only moves the mouth. Once you know the difference, you will see fake smiles everywhere, and the rare, genuine one will feel like a gift. The good news is that this isn't a talent you need to develop from scratch. It's a talent you need to remember. You had it once. You can rebuild it. Start small. In your next conversation, give yourself one goal. Notice a single moment where someone's facial expression doesn't match what they're saying. Don't interpret it yet. Just notice it. Over time, expand your awareness to voice, posture, and gesture. Write down what you see. Keep it simple. And above all, stop talking so much. The less you say, the more you see. The more space you create for the other person, the more they reveal. Erickson spent the rest of his life observing. He never stopped. He watched people walk in every city he visited. He studied strangers in cafes. He kept notebooks filled with observations that most people would never think to record. And with each passing year, he saw more, not less. The world became richer, more detailed, more alive with information that was always there, just waiting to be noticed. The masks people wear are real. We all wear them, and we need them. Social life depends on a degree of performance. But those masks have cracks, and if you learn to read the cracks, you will understand people at a level that most never reach. That is the power Erickson built from a paralyzed bed in rural Wisconsin. And it starts with a decision to stop performing your own role long enough to actually see the performance happening all around you. Now, reading people's masks is a powerful skill, but there's something even more fundamental, something that no amount of observation can change in another person. Beneath the masks, beneath the charm, beneath the stories people tell about themselves, there is a force that drives behavior more powerfully than anything we've discussed so far. It's called character, and once it's set, it almost never changes. Law 4. The law of compulsive behavior. Have you ever watched someone you care about make the same mistake for the third or fourth or fifth time, and wondered how they can't see what's so painfully obvious to everyone around them? Maybe it's a friend who keeps falling for the wrong person, not just once, every time. The names change, the faces change, but the story always ends the same way. Or maybe it's a colleague who manages to offend the wrong person at every job they've ever held. They blame bad luck, they blame office politics. They never once consider that the common denominator in every disaster is the person they see in the mirror. We notice these patterns in others instantly. We can see the loop running, but when it comes to our own lives, we are almost completely blind. And the reason we are blind is the same reason the pattern exists in the first place. It was stamped into us so early, so deep, that it operates below the level of conscious thought. We don't choose the pattern chose us. To understand this, let me tell you about a man whose pattern was visible to everyone except himself, and whose blindness to it cost him everything he had. To his aunts, uncles, and grandparents in Houston, Texas, Howard Hughes Jr. was a shy, awkward, excessively polite boy. His mother had nearly died giving birth to him and could never have another child, so she poured every ounce of her anxiety into protecting her only son. She monitored his every move. She controlled what he ate, what he wore, who he played with. She was terrified that something, illness, accident, the slightest germ, would take him away from her. His father, Howard Sr., was the opposite, a bold, restless entrepreneur who had built a fortune in the oil tool business. He was rarely home, always traveling, and when he was around, the boy felt the enormous weight of expectation, carry the family name, build something even bigger, be worthy of the Hughes legacy. So young Howard grew up trapped between two forces, a mother who suffocated him with control, and a father who demanded greatness from a distance. He was completely dependent on both of them for everything: direction, approval, identity. And to survive, he became what they needed him to be: obedient, quiet, polite to the point of invisibility. Then in 1922, his mother died suddenly. She was only 39. His father never recovered, and 2 years later, he died too. Howard was 19 years old, alone in the world, The two people who had controlled every aspect of his existence were gone, and what happened next stunned everyone who knew him. The polite, soft-spoken boy vanished overnight. In his place stood a belligerent, aggressive young man who refused to take advice from anyone. His relatives tried to step in and guide him. He cut them off, every last one of them. He petitioned a court to declare him a legal adult so he could take full control of the family fortune. He bought out every relative's share in the company. He wanted total independence, total control. No one above him, no one telling him what to do, ever again. What his relatives didn't understand was that the rebellion wasn't new. It had been there all along, buried beneath years of forced obedience. The resentment he'd felt toward his controlling mother, the helplessness of having every decision made for him, all of it had been building pressure for years. And the moment the lid came off, it exploded. Now, here's where the pattern begins to reveal itself. Hughes moved to Los Angeles and threw himself into two passions, filmmaking and flying. In 1927, he began producing an epic World War I aviation film called Hell's Angels. He hired a director, then fired him for not following his vision. He hired a second director, who quit after weeks of constant interference. His parting words were, "If you know so much, why don't you direct it yourself?" So Hughes did exactly that. He named himself director, and over the next 3 years, the production spiraled out of control. He ran through hundreds of crew members. He fired nearly every department head and took over their responsibilities personally. 3 stunt pilots died in accidents. The budget soared to almost $4 million, an astronomical sum at the time. The film premiered in 1930 and was a hit. The flying sequences were spectacular. The story was a mess, but audiences didn't care. Hughes was celebrated as a dashing maverick who had bucked the system and done it all himself. What nobody paid attention to was that the film had lost nearly $2 million, or that the only reason the flying footage was so impressive was because Hughes had spent 3 years and a fortune reshooting every scene until he was personally satisfied, not because of high standards, but because he couldn't tolerate anyone else making decisions. Hughes himself seemed to recognize the problem. He told reporters afterward, "Making Hell's Angels by myself was my biggest mistake. Trying to do the work of 12 men was just dumbness on my part. I learned by bitter experience that no one man can know everything." He learned nothing. During World War II, the military awarded Hughes Aircraft an $18 million contract to build enormous transport planes, flying boats that could ferry soldiers across oceans. It was a massive opportunity. If the company delivered on time and on budget, it would corner the market in military transport. Within a year, the project was behind schedule and hemorrhaging money. Hughes had hired a general manager to bring order to the chaos, then immediately began vetoing his decisions. The manager quit after 2 months. The same pattern that had consumed Hell's Angels was now consuming a military contract during wartime. The military grew desperate and insisted Hughes hire another manager, this time a man named Charles Perrell, widely regarded as the best in the business. Hughes turned on the charm. He was humble. He was contrite. He admitted his mistakes. He promised full authority. Perrell, impressed and against his better judgment, took the job. Within weeks, Perrell realized he'd been deceived. The project was further behind than Hughes had admitted. The drawings were shoddy. Nobody respected Perrell's authority because everyone knew who really ran the company. Hughes kept undermining every reform, and when the pressure became unbearable, Hughes disappeared, conveniently falling ill, just as he had done during the Hell's Angels production when things got difficult. By the end of the war, not a single reconnaissance plane had been delivered. The contract was cancelled. Perrell quit, broken by the experience. You would think that a failure this spectacular, a failure that had embarrassed him in front of the military, cost tens of millions and ruined his most capable manager, would have forced Hughes to confront the pattern. But character doesn't work that way. In 1948, Hughes bought a controlling interest in RKO Pictures, one of the most prestigious studios in Hollywood. The studio's new creative head, a man named Dorsey, was planning to transform RKO into the hottest studio for young directors. When he heard Hughes had bought the company, he decided to quit before the inevitable meddling began. But Hughes asked to meet him first, and in that meeting, he took Shari's hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "I want no part of running the studio. You'll be left alone." Shari stayed. For a few weeks, everything was exactly as Hughes had promised. Then the phone call started. Hughes wanted a different actress. He wanted changes to the script. He had opinions about the lighting, the editing, the marketing. Shari resigned immediately. Hughes replaced him with men who followed orders. He took over production of a film called Jet Pilot and turned it into Hell's Angels all over again. 3 years to finish, a budget that ballooned to $4 million, so much footage that he couldn't decide how to cut it. By the time it was released, 6 years after filming began, the jet footage was outdated and the star looked noticeably older. The film was a complete failure. Within a few years, Hughes had run the once profitable studio into the ground and was forced to sell. And then it happened again. In the 1960s, the military awarded Hughes a contract to build light observation helicopters for the Vietnam War. He won the bid by submitting a price so low it was clear he intended to lose money on the initial run, then raise prices on future orders. When the military sent inspectors to check on progress, they found the same disaster they would have found 20 years earlier. No organized production line, inadequate tools, shoddy drawings, too few skilled workers, the same chaos, the same micromanagement, the same collapse. The loss on the helicopter contract was $90 million. In 1976, Howard Hughes died on an airplane. He weighed 93 pounds. He had spent his final years in sealed hotel rooms, addicted to painkillers, terrified of germs, cared for by a handful of assistants who had quietly wrested control of the company away from the man who could not bear to let anyone else make a single decision. The man who feared losing control more than anything ended his life at the complete mercy of others. And the pattern that destroyed him had been visible from the very beginning, to everyone except him. There's an ancient Roman orator named Cassius Severus who illustrates this law in an almost comically dark way. Severus gained fame with fiery speeches attacking powerful officials. The authorities warned him to stop. He didn't. The crowds got bored and started to thin out, so he made his attacks even more vicious. They burned his books and banished him to the island of Crete. On Crete, he simply continued his campaign, sending copies of his latest insults back to Rome. They warned him again. He responded by haranguing and insulting the local officials on Crete who wanted him executed. So the Senate banished him to a barren rock in the middle of the Aegean Sea, where he spent his final 8 years, and we can imagine him there, still composing speeches that absolutely nobody would ever hear. How do you break a pattern you can't even see? It starts with accepting that you have a character, not the kind you chose, but the kind that was formed by your genetics, your earliest attachments, and the habits you developed before you were old enough to know what a habit was. This character produces patterns, decisions you make again and again, strategies you fall back on under stress, ways of relating to people that feel so natural, so automatic, that you don't even recognize them as patterns. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The weakest parts of your character are the ones that create the strongest patterns, because weak traits don't require effort. They're reflexive. They're the path of least resistance. Strength takes practice. Weakness just runs on autopilot. But this law is not a death sentence. It's an invitation. Consider the actress Joan Crawford, whose childhood was as difficult as it gets. An absent father, a mother who actively disliked her, constant beatings, endless betrayals. She could have let that stamp define her. Instead, she examined her flaws with ruthless honesty. She was hypersensitive. She craved love to a desperate degree. She needed a father figure. In Hollywood, those vulnerabilities could destroy a person in months, but Crawford turned each one into a tool. She channeled her sensitivity outward, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense what directors wanted before they said a word. She poured her desperate need to be loved into the camera itself, and audiences felt it. The directors who worked with her became the father figures she craved, and she gave them an almost fanatical loyalty that made her a pleasure to direct. That is the alchemy this law demands. You don't erase the stamp. You don't pretend it isn't there. You face it directly, and you bend it into something useful. Start by examining your past honestly. Look at the decisions that went wrong, not once, but repeatedly. Look at the relationships that ended the same way. Look at how you behave under stress, when the mask slips and the raw character shows through. What do you see? That is your pattern. And the people who face it honestly are the ones who finally gain the power to change their fate. Mastering your emotions, reading the narcissism inside yourself and others, learning to see through the masks people wear, recognizing the patterns that silently run your life. These are all powers that require you to look inward. But the next law is different. It asks you to look outward, at the invisible force that makes you reach for things you don't need, chase what you can't have, and lose interest the moment you get what you wanted. Law 5. The law of covetousness. Why do we always want what we don't have? Not sometimes, always. The moment you possess something, a relationship, a job, an achievement, your mind begins to wander toward the next thing, the thing you haven't touched yet, the thing that glows a little brighter because it's just out of reach. This isn't a character flaw, it's a fundamental feature of human psychology. It's as old as the human species, and maybe the oldest recorded example comes from a story almost everyone knows. When Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt, you would think they'd have been grateful. They were free. They'd witnessed miracles, the parting of an ocean, plagues that brought an empire to its knees. God himself was guiding them through the wilderness. But almost immediately they started complaining. The desert was harsh. The food was plain. They looked back at Egypt, the place where they had been enslaved, beaten, worked to the bone, and they said they missed it. They missed the cucumbers and the melons. They missed the meat. God provided manna from heaven, and they griped about that too. It sounds absurd, but before you judge them, consider how often you do the same thing. You leave a job that made you miserable, and within months you're remembering only the good parts. You end a relationship that wasn't working, and suddenly all you can think about is the one perfect weekend you shared. You get the promotion you chased for years and feel a rush of satisfaction that lasts, a week, 2? And then your eyes drift to the next rung of the ladder and the familiar hunger returns. There are 3 things about the human brain that make this pattern almost inescapable. First, our minds are wired for contrast. The moment you see or experience something, your brain automatically generates the opposite image. If you're told not to think about something, that is immediately all you can think about. Every restriction sparks the desire to transgress. Every possession highlights what's missing. This is called induction, and it runs beneath your conscious awareness at all times. Second, evolution did not design us to be content. A satisfied ancestor, one who sat back and enjoyed the view, was a dead ancestor. We survived because our brains were tuned for restlessness, alertness, and the constant suspicion that things could be better or that danger lurked nearby. We no longer live on savannas surrounded by predators, but the wiring hasn't changed. We are built to want more, to never quite be satisfied. And third, here's the one that really gets us. What we imagine feels almost as real as what we experience. Brain scans show that the neural activity produced by vividly imagining something is remarkably similar to the activity produced by actually doing it. Our fantasies feel real because neurologically they almost are, and fantasies are limitless. Reality is full of friction, compromise, and imperfection. So we drift always toward the fantasy, toward the thing we don't yet have. One woman understood all of this so deeply that she used it to change the way the entire world dressed. In 1895, an 11-year-old girl named Gabrielle sat by her mother's bed and watched her die. Tuberculosis. Gabrielle and her siblings had grown up in poverty, shuffled between relatives. Their father was an itinerant peddler who hated responsibility and was rarely home. A few days after the mother's death, he showed up, deposited Gabrielle and her two sisters at a convent run by nuns, and promised to return soon. He never came back. The convent was austere, stone walls, plain food, two identical shapeless dresses for each girl, no music except hymns, no luxuries of any kind. Gabrielle tried to adapt, but the restlessness was unbearable. Then one day she discovered a stash of romance novels that had been smuggled in, stories about poor, forgotten girls who are suddenly swept into worlds of wealth and beauty through some twist of fate. Gabrielle devoured them. She could feel herself inside those stories, and what captivated her most were the descriptions of the dresses, the fabrics, the cuts, the way a gown could transform someone from invisible to unforgettable. This was everything she wanted and everything she was forbidden to have. She left the convent at 18, trained as a seamstress, tried the theater under the stage name Coco. She had energy and charisma, but not enough talent. Then luck, or something like it, placed her in the chateau of a wealthy young man named Etienne Balsan, who lived a life of total leisure, surrounded by courtesans. These women had everything Coco wanted: beauty, freedom, enormous wardrobes. But Coco looked nothing like them. She was boyish, flat-chested, not a conventional beauty in any way. She seemed to have nothing to offer in this world of voluptuous, glamorous women. And then one day, without quite knowing what she was doing, she wandered into Balsan's bedroom and took some of his clothes. She put on one of his open-collared shirts. She wore his tweed coat over a simple skirt. She topped it with a man's straw hat. And something shifted. Two things happened simultaneously. First, she felt free. The corsets, the heavy gowns, the towering headpieces that women of the era strapped themselves into every morning, all of it was gone. She could move. She could breathe. She could ride a horse, not side saddle like the other women, but properly, in jodhpurs she had custom made. And second, people stared, not with disapproval, with fascination. The courtesans couldn't stop looking at her. They were captivated by this androgynous style that nobody had ever seen a woman wear. Balsan himself was charmed. Within weeks, the women were visiting Coco's room, trying on the straw hats she had decorated with ribbons and feathers. These hats were simple, almost absurdly so compared to the elaborate constructions fashionable women wore, but that was exactly the appeal. They were easy to wear, they were different, and someone else already desired them. Think about what happened in that moment. For her entire life, Coco Chanel had been the one doing the wanting the palaces in the romance novels, wanting a career on the stage, wanting the beauty and freedom of the courtesans, always reaching for something beyond her grasp. And the moment she got it, the chateau, the wealthy man, she felt restless again, disappointed. The fantasy had been better than the reality. But now, standing in a man's stolen shirt with a straw hat on her head, the dynamic reversed completely. She was no longer wanting, she was wanted. Other people were reaching for her. And that reversal, that shift from coveting to being coveted, became the foundation of one of the most successful brands in history. She opened a shop in Paris selling her hats. Then she expanded to Deauville, where all the fashionable Parisians spent their summers. She wore her own creations everywhere, androgynous, easy to move in, and just provocative enough to make people stop and stare. She shocked locals by swimming in the ocean in a bathing costume she designed herself, because one barely existed for women. She cut her own hair short. She took one of Balsan's sweaters, cut it open, added buttons, and invented the modern cardigan. Everything she did carried a faint note of transgression. These weren't your mother's clothes. Wearing Chanel meant crossing a line, blurring the boundary between masculine and feminine, between proper and daring, and that whiff of the forbidden was precisely what made people want it. But her most brilliant move was still to come. By 1920, Chanel was one of the most important designers in the world, but she wanted something bigger, something that could reach women who would never walk into her store, something almost invisible, literally in the air. She decided to create a perfume. At the time, perfumes were named after flowers and smelled like specific blooms: rose, lavender, jasmine. Chanel went in the opposite direction. She wanted something that didn't smell like any single flower, something abstract, something that would smell different on every woman who wore it. She called it Chanel No. 5, a name as cold and clinical as a laboratory formula. She packaged it in a sleek, minimalist bottle with her interlocking C logo. It looked like nothing else on any shelf, and her launch strategy was pure psychological genius. She sprayed the scent everywhere in her Paris store without telling anyone what it was. Customers kept asking about it. She played dumb. Then she slipped unlabeled bottles into the shopping bags of her wealthiest clients. Within days, women across Paris were talking about this mysterious new fragrance, haunting, impossible to identify, impossible to ignore. By the time she placed bottles on the shelves, women were showing up in crowds, desperate to buy something they hadn't even known existed a week earlier. It became the most successful perfume in history, not because of what it was, a mixture of ordinary jasmine and synthetic chemicals, but because of what it made people feel. It triggered the oldest force in human psychology, the desire for what you cannot quite name, what you cannot quite have, what someone else already wants. That is the law of covetousness. We do not want things because they are inherently valuable. We want them because they are just out of reach, because other people want them, and because they carry a faint charge of the forbidden. Imagine this in your own life. Think about the last time you wanted something badly: a job, a relationship, a possession. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of that desire came from the thing itself, and how much came from the fact that it was difficult to get, that others wanted it too, or that having it felt like crossing some invisible line? If you're honest, you'll find that the wanting was almost always more pleasurable than the having. The fantasy was better than the reality. That's not a flaw in the particular thing you chased. It's a flaw, or rather a feature, of how your mind works. Chanel understood this because she had lived it. Her entire childhood was defined by wanting what she couldn't have, and instead of remaining trapped in that wanting, she learned to reverse it, to become the object of other people's desire by surrounding herself and her creations with mystery, transgression, and the one quality that always makes people lean in: unavailability. The practical lesson here is twofold. First, when it comes to creating anything, whether it's a product, a career, or a public presence, understand that mystery and restraint are more powerful than oversaturation. Don't reveal everything. Don't be constantly available. Leave room for people's imaginations to work. The more they have to fill in the blanks, the more invested they become. And second, when it comes to your own desires, learn to see the pattern. Notice how quickly the glow fades once you get what you wanted. Notice how your mind immediately reaches for the next thing. Instead of chasing what's distant, try looking at what's close: the people in your life right now, the work in front of you right now, the place where you actually live. If you can learn to see depth where you used to see only boredom, you will find something far more lasting than the thrill of the chase. So far, every law we've covered has asked you to look inward, at your emotions, your narcissism, the masks you wear, the patterns that drive you, the desires that pull you. But the final law in this first part asks you to look forward, at the dimension most people ignore until it's too late: time and how your relationship with it determines almost everything that happens to you. Law 6. The law of shortsightedness. What if one of the smartest men who ever lived, a man who literally discovered the laws of gravity and motion, made the dumbest financial decision of his life because he couldn't think more than a week ahead? In the year 1719, a man named John Blunt sat in London, reading news from Paris with growing envy. The French were in the middle of an economic explosion. A venture called the Mississippi Company, designed to exploit riches in the Louisiana territories, had turned ordinary citizens into what the French were calling millionaires, a word that was coined in those very months. Money was pouring into France from all over Europe. Blunt was the son of a shoemaker who had clawed his way to the top of English finance. He was the lead director of the South Sea Company, which handled part of the English government's massive debts. He had relationships with the most powerful men in the country, including King George I himself. And now, watching the French get rich, Blunt felt something dangerous stirring inside him, a toxic blend of ambition and jealousy that shut down the careful, pragmatic thinking that had gotten him this far. He conceived of a scheme so audacious it would either make him the most celebrated man in England or destroy him entirely. The South Sea Company would pay the government a fee to take over the entire national debt, over £31 million. Then it would privatize that debt, converting it into shares in the company. Creditors could swap their government IOUs for company stock. Whatever shares remained would be sold to the public. As long as the share price kept rising, everyone would get rich. Debt would be magically transformed into wealth. When King George first heard the proposal, he was confused. He couldn't understand how a negative, debt, could become a positive. But Blunt spoke with such conviction that the king was swept along, and George had his own reasons for wanting to believe. He was one of the most unpopular kings in English history, German by birth, coarse in manner, with a thick accent that made his subjects cringe. He was desperate for a win. Blunt was offering him one. He threw his full weight behind the plan. Parliament approved the scheme in April of 1720. The king showed up at the South Sea House and publicly invested £100,000. The signal was unmistakable. If the king himself was buying in, this was a sure thing. And the frenzy began. At first it was the wealthy and powerful who converged on Exchange Alley, the narrow streets where stocks were sold. Artists and intellectuals piled in. Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, John Gay, Sir Isaac Newton invested £7,000. The share price climbed past 200, then 300, then 400. Farmers in the countryside pulled their life savings from under their beds and sent their sons to London with fistfuls of coins. Actresses were rubbing elbows with duchesses in the street. Women who had never touched a financial instrument in their lives were fighting for shares. One woman covered her dress in jewels worth £5,000. Footmen quit their jobs, bought carriages, and hired footmen of their own. An aristocratic lady arrived at the opera to discover that her former maid now occupied a more expensive box than hers. The entire country seemed to have lost its mind. Jonathan Swift wrote in a letter to a friend, "What is the religion of England? South Sea stock. What is the policy? South Sea. What is the trade? South Sea. What is the business? Nothing but South Sea." And standing at the center of all of it, pumping the bellows, was John Blunt. He kept offering more generous terms to lure in more buyers. Only 20% down, then only 10%. For every £400 invested, he would lend 300. He wanted the share price to keep climbing because the entire scheme depended on it. If the price rose, everyone won. If it fell, even slightly, the whole structure would collapse like a house built on smoke. And here is the question that Blunt somehow never asked himself. The question so obvious that it borders on the absurd. What happens when the price stops rising? The South Sea Company had no real assets. It had done almost no actual trading in South America. Its only tangible income was the interest the government paid on the debt. There was nothing underneath the rising price, except the collective belief that it would keep rising. And a belief, no matter how fervent, is not a foundation. Blunt had unknowingly created a monster. The frenzy he'd ignited had spawned dozens of imitation ventures, some legitimate, some patently ridiculous, including one company that promised to develop a wheel of perpetual motion. Every pound that people invested in these schemes was a pound they weren't investing in South Sea stock. Cash was draining away, and in France, the Mississippi venture was already collapsing. The mood on the continent was turning. Panicking, Blunt pushed Parliament to pass something called the Bubble Act, which banned all unauthorized joint stock companies. He thought this would eliminate the competition. Instead, it destroyed thousands of people who had invested their savings in those ventures. Now the only way they could recover their money was to sell their South Sea shares. The selling began, the price wobbled, more people sold, the wobble became a slide, the slide became a panic. In August, with crowds forming outside the South Sea house desperate to unload their shares, Blunt made one last play. He launched another subscription at £1,000 per share, with absurdly generous terms and a promise of a 30% Christmas dividend. Some people were pulled back in, including Sir Isaac Newton himself, who reinvested nearly everything he had. It was too late. The illusion had shattered. People were no longer asking how much they could make. They were asking a different question, the question Blunt should have asked at the very beginning. What is this actually worth? The crash came hard and fast. Fortunes evaporated overnight. The Bank of England nearly ran out of currency. A wave of suicides swept the country, including Blunt's own nephew, who slashed his throat when he learned the size of his losses. Isaac Newton lost £20,000, the equivalent of millions today. For the rest of his life, the mere mention of finance made him physically ill. Blunt himself was hounded in the streets and nearly killed. He fled London and spent his remaining years in the town of Bath, living on the scraps that Parliament left him after seizing nearly everything he'd earned. What makes this story so haunting is not the greed. Greed is everywhere. What's haunting is that none of it had to happen. The scheme's fatal flaw, that it depended on a price rise with no real asset beneath it, was visible from the start. To anyone willing to think even a few months ahead, the outcome was almost certain. But no one was willing to think a few months ahead. Not Blunt, not the King, not Parliament, not even Isaac Newton. Why not? Because short-term thinking is hardwired into us. Our brains evolved to respond to what is immediate, the predator in front of us, the fruit on the branch, the opportunity right now. This served us well on the savannah. It serves us terribly in a complex world where every action has consequences that ripple outward for months and years. When something dramatic is happening in the present, prices are soaring, everyone around you is getting rich, the mood is electric, your brain locks onto that drama and loses its ability to project forward. The emotional intensity of the moment shrinks your mental time frame until you can barely see past next week. And the more emotional the situation, the shorter your horizon becomes. This is why bubbles keep happening. The South Sea crash, the railway mania of the 1840s, the crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble, 2008. The pattern is identical every time. A wave of collective excitement, fueled by short-term thinking, ending in a crash that everyone claims nobody could have predicted. But the truth is that plenty of people predicted it. They were simply drowned out by the noise of the present. And this doesn't just apply to markets. It applies to your life. Every time you react to an insult without pausing to consider the consequences. Every time you jump on a trend without asking where it leads. Every time you make a decision driven by the emotion of the moment, excitement, panic, anger, impatience, you are giving in to the same force that destroyed John Blunt and swallowed the savings of a nation. Now consider the opposite. During the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln faced a version of this pressure every single day for 4 years. The North had more men and more resources, but early defeats sent the public into panic. After the disaster at Bull Run, even level-headed voices urged Lincoln to negotiate peace with the South. Others demanded he throw everything into one massive attack, even though the army wasn't ready. The newspapers hammered him. His approval ratings cratered. His own advisors doubted him, and Lincoln held. He had assessed the larger picture. The North's advantages in manpower and industry would prevail, but only if he had enough time to develop the right generals and the right strategy. Every day, the world screamed at him to react, to do something dramatic, to prove himself. And every day, he resisted, because he understood something most people never learn. The passage of time reveals what the present conceals. When the tide finally turned, first at Vicksburg, then at Gettysburg, Lincoln was hailed as a genius. But months later, when Grant got bogged down and casualties mounted, the panic returned. Lincoln's re-election seemed impossible. One night in August of 1864, he actually drafted a letter of surrender, but he couldn't bring himself to send it. He hid it in a drawer. A week later, General Sherman marched into Atlanta, and the doubt vanished for good. The writer Harriet Beecher Stowe visited Lincoln during the war, and later described what she saw: a man surrounded by traitors and timid advisors and radicals, all pulling him in different directions, who listened to everyone, yielded where necessary, but never lost sight of one inflexible purpose. He drew the national ship through. That is what far-sighted thinking looks like in practice. It is not a personality trait. It is a discipline. And like any discipline, it can be trained. Start with patience. When something happens that demands a response, an insult, an opportunity, a crisis, train yourself to pause. Not for a moment, for a day, for 2 days. Let the emotion settle. Let the first wave of reactivity pass. You will be amazed at how different the situation looks when you see it from the other side of sleep. Second, when you do decide to act, think in chains. Not just what happens next, but what happens after that, and after that. Who else will be affected? How will they respond? What second-order consequences might your action trigger that you haven't considered? Third, and this might be the most important one, maintain a clear sense of your long-term priorities. Know what you are actually trying to build, not this week, not this quarter, over the next 5 years, over the next decade. When you have that clarity, every short-term drama shrinks to its proper size. You stop reacting to noise and start responding to signal. The far-sighted perspective will not make you popular in the moment. The people around you are always reacting, always panicking, always chasing the latest trend. Your calm will frustrate them. Your patience will confuse them. But over time, and time is always the ultimate judge, they will see what you saw first, and they will wish they had listened. Key takeaways. Let's step back and look at what these 6 laws are really telling us, because on the surface they seem like separate ideas: irrationality, narcissism, masks, character, desire, short-sightedness. But underneath, they are all pointing at the same truth. You are not who you think you are. You believe you make rational decisions, but your emotions are steering the wheel before your conscious mind even wakes up. You think you see people clearly, but you're reading their masks and mistaking them for their faces. You believe your character is flexible and that you can change whenever you decide to, but the patterns stamped into you in your earliest years are running on a loop beneath everything you do. You are convinced that what you want is what you actually need, but your desires are pulled by invisible strings: comparison, fantasy, the thrill of the forbidden, and you think you're planning for the future. But most of the time, you are simply reacting to whatever is loudest in the present moment. None of this makes you broken. It makes you human. Every person you will ever meet is subject to these same forces, and the vast majority of them will go through their entire lives without ever examining what drives them, but you don't have to. Imagine an ordinary moment in your life, a meeting at work, a disagreement with someone you're close to, a decision about what to do next with your career. Now imagine running that moment through the 6 laws, one by one. Your emotions are coloring the situation before you've even analyzed it. That's law 1. The other person is filtering everything through their own self-absorption, their need for validation, law 2. You're both wearing masks, projecting confidence or agreeability that doesn't match what's happening inside, law 3. Both of you are falling back on patterns that were set long before this moment, law 4. One of you is chasing something that looks desirable mostly because it's out of reach, law 5. And neither of you has paused long enough to consider what this decision will look like 6 months from now, law 6. When you see a situation through that lens, something remarkable happens. The confusion lifts, the drama shrinks. You stop feeling blindsided by other people's behavior because you understand the forces driving it. You stop beating yourself up for your own recurring mistakes because you finally see the pattern, and seeing it is the first step toward breaking it. The first and most important step is awareness, not abstract awareness, not reading about these ideas once and nodding along and then going back to your usual patterns. Real awareness, the kind that makes you pause in the middle of an argument and ask yourself, am I reacting to what this person actually said, or to something inside me that has nothing to do with them? The kind that makes you watch a charming new acquaintance and think, this is very pleasant, but what's underneath it? The kind that makes you look at your own life and see not a list of achievements, but a pattern of decisions, some of them compulsive, that reveal who you actually are. The second step is turning your attention outward. Almost every problem described in these 6 laws comes from being too locked inside your own head, too absorbed in your own emotions, your own desires, your own reactions. The antidote is empathy. Not as a vague moral virtue, but as a practical skill. Learn to read people. Listen more than you talk. Watch more than you speak. Pay attention to the second language, the one spoken in faces and voices and posture, not in words. And the third step is patience. This might be the hardest of all, because our entire culture pushes us in the opposite direction, toward speed, toward reaction, toward the shortest possible path between wanting something and having it. But the people who master these laws are not the fastest. They are the most patient. They step back. They let time do its work. They resist the noise of the present and keep their eyes on the longer arc. These 6 laws are not just ideas about other people. They are mirrors, and the person who benefits most from looking into them is you. Now take a moment. Think about one relationship in your life right now, just one, where something feels off, where there's tension you can't explain, or a pattern that keeps repeating, or a feeling in your gut that you've been ignoring. Ask yourself, which of these laws is at work? Is it your own irrationality clouding the picture? Is it narcissism, yours or theirs, creating a one-way current? Are you reading a mask and calling it a face? Is an old pattern from childhood driving your reactions without your permission? Are you chasing a fantasy version of this person instead of seeing who they actually are? Or are you simply too deep in the present, too reactive, too impatient to step back and see the larger picture? You don't have to answer right now, but carry the question with you. Let it work on you, because this is how the laws of human nature start to change your life. Not in one dramatic flash of insight, but in the slow accumulation of moments where you see a little more clearly than you did before. If you want to own this book and go deeper into every idea we covered today, I'll leave a link to it in the description, along with a free trial of Audible if you'd like to listen to the full audiobook. It is genuinely worth your time. And before you go, we've only covered 6 of the 18 laws in this book. The next 6 go even deeper. What happens when you try to change someone's mind and they resist you at every turn, not because they disagree, but because of a force inside them that has nothing to do with logic? What is the hidden attitude that silently shapes everything that happens to you? Your relationships, your career, even your health? And what is the dark side of your personality that you've spent your entire life hiding from yourself? And what happens when it finally breaks free? Part 2 is on the channel now. I'll see you there. If you found value in this, subscribe. There is always another book that can change the way you see the world. And leave me a comment. Of these 6 laws, which one hit closest to home? Which pattern did you recognize in yourself? I'd love to know. Remember, you are not a prisoner of your nature, but you cannot escape what you refuse to see. The first step is always the hardest and the most important, and you just took it.